The morning of May 15th, 1944, dawned over the vast, unforgiving landscape of Texas. The air, heavy with the scent of dust and heat, clung to everything it touched. In the distance, the sounds of military trucks rumbled across the parched earth, their wheels kicking up clouds of dry dirt as they carried their precious cargo. The convoy wound its way toward the remote internment camp, located far from the coastal towns and the war's chaos. A place where the brutality of the global conflict would soon be felt in a way none of the prisoners could have imagined. In the camp, a group of German women, captured prisoners of war, stood in formation, waiting. Their faces, worn from exhaustion, reflected the horrors they had witnessed during their service to the Reich. For many of them, the thought of captivity was just as unbearable as the possibility of death. These women had been soldiers in the Nazi medical corps, working in the rear lines, tending to wounded soldiers, or caring for civilian casualties. But now, they were enemies, prisoners, captured by the Allies and brought to the American South as they stood in the heat. They were unaware of the bizarre and profound ritual they were about to undergo, a ritual that would shake them to their very core. What would seem like a simple act of hygiene to their American captors would become an emotional and cultural ordeal for the German women. They were to shower. The order came as a shock. The American military guards, under instructions from higher command, had been tasked with ensuring the prisoners were properly cleaned and cared for in accordance with Geneva Convention standards. The soldiers knew they were expected to treat prisoners of war with respect, but for the German women, this simple, human task became something far more complicated. None of them could have anticipated what would follow when they entered the shower facilities. They were herded into the showers, instructed to remove their clothing, and then, to their horror, the guards ordered them to use soap. The simple act of using soap, a common practice for most soldiers, was something these women had never imagined would be so traumatic. To the American soldiers, it was a routine task, an attempt to restore some semblance of normalcy to the lives of their enemies. To the German women, however, it was a profound humiliation in the extreme heat of the Texas desert. The women were already physically drained from the long journey, the deprivation, and the trauma of captivity. They had been stripped of their uniforms and their dignity, and now they were being asked to expose themselves further to their captors. For many of the women, the soap was not just an agent of cleanliness. It became a symbol of their vulnerability. To wash, to submit to this act of hygiene in front of strangers, was to acknowledge their status as prisoners, as objects rather than soldiers. It was a violent ritual, one that forced them to confront their new reality. They were no longer the powerful, disciplined members of the Nazi war machine. They were now powerless, as the cold water cascaded over them. Many of the women began to weep. The tears flowed not because of the physical discomfort, but because of the emotional weight of the experience. Their minds raced with memories of the battles, of the speeches they had heard about the invincibility of the Reich, of the superiority of their race, and of the Nazi ideals they had been trained to uphold. Now, they were reduced to a pitiful, exposed state, a far cry from the fearsome image they had once held of themselves. They were no longer in control of their bodies, their fates, or their identities. The soap, so simple and innocuous in its purpose, had stripped them of all the illusions they had held onto since the start of the war. Among the women was Ingrid, a nurse who had worked on the Eastern Front, treating the wounded and dying of the German army. She had seen horrors no one should have to witness: mass graves, starving soldiers, and the endless suffering of civilians caught in the crossfire of war. Yet none of that compared to the shame she felt as the American soldiers looked on while she, and the others, complied with the humiliating order. For Ingrid, the shower was a metaphor for the collapse of everything she had believed in. The Reich was no longer the unstoppable force it once seemed, and she, like the others, had fallen victim to the consequences of her nation's hubris. Ingrid and her fellow prisoners had been transported across the Atlantic, from the battlefields of Europe to the arid expanses of Texas, under the belief that they were invincible soldiers. But now, the simple act of washing had become a painful reminder of their defeat and submission. The emotional toll was unbearable for some, as they were reminded of their powerlessness, and for others, the sight of their tears was a stark reflection of their broken dreams. The American soldiers, who had given the order, and watched from a distance, could not fully understand the gravity of what they had witnessed. For them, the act of showering was simply a matter of routine, part of the process of ensuring the health and safety of their prisoners. But they could see the emotional toll it took on the German women. The American soldiers, many of whom had fought in brutal conditions across Europe, had no personal animosity toward their captives. For them, the act of caring for prisoners, no matter their nationality, was part of their duty as soldiers. But in the face of the women's emotional reactions, some of them felt an uncomfortable guilt. They had been ordered to treat the prisoners humanely, and they had followed those orders. But the trauma of war could not be erased by a shower. Ingrid's tears were not just tears of humiliation. They were tears of grief. She mourned the loss of the war, of her comrades, and of her own belief in the cause she had served. The soap, the water, and the helplessness of the situation all combined to force her to see her role in the war in a new light. The moment she stood there, scrubbing herself with soap while soldiers watched, was a moment that crystallized her understanding of the conflict. It was not about victory. It was not about superiority. It was about the senselessness of it all. It was about how war stripped away the veneer of civilization and left behind only the raw, painful truth of human suffering. Ingrid would never forget the moment she stood in that shower, feeling the cold water cascade over her skin, knowing that the very thing she had fought for, her identity as a nurse, as a soldier of the Reich, had been shattered. The soap, so simple in its purpose, had become a symbol of the bitter truth: the enemy had won. And now she and her comrades were left to face the aftermath. For the German women prisoners, the experience in the Texas camp was a pivotal moment in their journey through the war. It was not just a humiliating experience. It was a moment of reckoning. They were no longer soldiers of the Reich, but women caught in the aftermath of a lost war. The soap, the tears, and the shower would become a haunting memory, a moment they would carry with them forever. The emotional toll of that day would not be easily erased, even as the war wound to a close and the world around them began to heal. The scars of the war were not just physical. They were emotional and psychological, and they would remain with these women long after the war ended. The aftermath of that fateful day in the Texas POW camp would remain with the German women long after the war ended. The shower, though seemingly a simple act of cleanliness, had become a symbol of their deep psychological transformation. It was not only a physical cleansing, but also a painful ritual of humbling, a stripping away of their former identities as soldiers in the Nazi war machine. What they had once held as symbols of power, dignity, and national pride had been reduced to nothing more than humiliating reminders of their helplessness. The world they had known, the world where their uniforms were symbols of authority and their service was exalted, had crumbled into a chaotic, foreign reality where they were nothing but defeated prisoners. For Ingrid and her fellow POWs, the moments in the shower room, though brief, represented a profound shift in their personal and collective identities. In the war, they had been trained to believe in their superiority, to embrace the role of caretakers and soldiers, holding the lives of others in their hands. But in this instant, they were now the ones in need of care, their fate dictated by the very people they had been taught to despise. The tears that followed in the wake of the shower were not only born of humiliation, but also of disbelief and sorrow for their shattered ideals. As the days passed in the camp, the German prisoners were subjected to other experiences that continued to erode their former sense of self. The American guards, though professional and respectful, treated them with a humanity that was both unsettling and heartwarming. Despite the deep psychological divide between the captors and the captured, these moments of compassion could not be easily erased. The POWs were fed, clothed, and treated with the basic decency that was owed to prisoners of war. But it was clear that the nurses and caretakers who had once been so adept at administering care to others now found themselves dependent on the very hands that had once been enemies for the American soldiers and guards. The German women were just another group of POWs to manage. But even they couldn't ignore the tension that hung in the air, the awkwardness of their relationship with the prisoners. The emotional reactions from the women, trembling hands, tears, moments of quiet introspection, had a profound effect on the soldiers, many of whom had just witnessed the horrors of war firsthand. To see these women reduced to tears by something as simple as a shower was an uncomfortable reminder of the emotional toll the war had taken on both sides. Ingrid, like many of the other women, had to wrestle with the growing sense of guilt and disillusionment that began to define her days in captivity. She had come from a life of military discipline, a life where her loyalty to the Reich had been unquestioned. She had lived through the atrocities of the Eastern Front, tending to the wounded, enduring the harshest conditions, and pushing herself beyond the limits of human endurance. Yet here, in the quiet of the Texas camp, she felt small, exposed, and vulnerable, emotions she had never been taught to express. The once proud woman who had seen herself as a soldier now felt stripped of her role, her identity shattered by the simple act of washing with soap under the watchful eyes of American soldiers. The pain of that experience went far beyond the physical discomfort of the shower. It was the overwhelming sense of defeat that accompanied it. The soldiers who had fought alongside Ingrid, who had believed in the same ideals of national pride and power, had not only lost the war, but had also been humiliated by their captors. They had been reduced to prisoners of war, forced to confront their own vulnerability and fragility. The soap, in its innocuous simplicity, had become a tool of that reckoning. A reminder that, for all their training, all their preparation, all their strength, they were powerless now. As Ingrid and her fellow prisoners continued to adjust to their new life in captivity, they found themselves grappling with a myriad of emotions: resentment, guilt, confusion, and even a deep sense of gratitude. The American soldiers were treating them with respect, offering food and shelter, and providing medical care when necessary. But that care, so seemingly ordinary to the soldiers, was a luxury these women had never expected. They had been raised to believe in the righteousness of their cause, to believe that they were the ones offering help and assistance to the wounded and the oppressed. But now, it was they who needed help, and they were at the mercy of their captors. For Ingrid, and others like her, the shock of this role reversal would be a source of constant internal conflict. How could she reconcile the image of herself as a protector, a caretaker, with the image of herself as a prisoner, reliant on the very people she had once fought against? The moral complexity of this situation was not lost on her. She had always prided herself on her role as a nurse, someone who was dedicated to alleviating the suffering of others. But now, she was faced with a new kind of suffering, the kind that came from within, the kind that could not be treated with bandages or medicine. Days turned into weeks, and as the reality of their captivity set in, Ingrid and the other nurses began to form unexpected bonds with their American captors. The barriers of nationality, of language, and of ideology began to blur as both sides tried to navigate the delicate balance of prisoner and captor, of enemy and caregiver. The American guards, many of whom had served in the Pacific and European theaters, began to see the German women not as faceless enemies, but as human beings. Individuals who had been swept up in the same war that had torn apart their own lives. For Ingrid, the relationship with her American captors was complex. She began to understand the deep sense of compassion that drove them, the same compassion that had led them to provide care to her and her fellow prisoners. And yet, the shadows of the past still lingered in the corners of her mind. She could not forget the violence that had been perpetrated by her own people, the atrocities that had been committed in the name of nationalism and racial superiority. And she could not easily reconcile the kindness she received from her captors with the suffering inflicted on countless innocent civilians during the war in the weeks and months that followed. Ingrid and the other German POWs would come to terms with the reality of their captivity, but they would also grapple with the deeper, more personal question of their place in the world. They would be forced to reckon with their own complicity in the war and with the haunting memory of the moment when they had been forced to strip away their own identities in that Texas shower. And, for some, the scars of that experience would last far longer than the physical ones. Long after the war had ended and the world had moved on, the emotional toll of their captivity would remain, etched into their hearts and minds. In the end, the German nurses, those women who had once fought in the name of an ideal now discredited and destroyed, would return to a world irrevocably changed. They would carry with them the memory of that moment in the shower, the moment when they were reduced to tears by a simple act of hygiene. It would be a memory that haunted them, but also one that forced them to confront the very human cost of the war they had once been part of. And for the American soldiers, the memory of those women, stripped of their dignity, yet shown compassion, would serve as a reminder of the true cost of war and the lasting power of kindness. In the face of unimaginable suffering, the psychological impact of the German women, POW's experience in Texas extended far beyond their immediate treatment and captivity. Their journey, spanning both the physical and emotional trials of war, would come to represent a deeper, more universal struggle, the confrontation with guilt, shame, and humanity in the aftermath of a brutal conflict. For these women, the war had not only stolen their sense of identity as soldiers, but had also forced them to reckon with their complicity in a regime that had caused unimaginable suffering. When the war ended, Ingrid and her fellow nurses were released and returned to a Germany that was grappling with its own sense of identity. The country was physically shattered, morally broken, and politically in turmoil. These women, who had once worn the uniform of the Reich, found themselves navigating a new reality. They were caught between the world they had left behind, a world of authority, ideology, and belief, and the stark truth of what had been revealed to them during their captivity. The shower in Texas, where they had been reduced to tears, remained a metaphor for the stripping away of everything they had once held dear. Many of the German women POWs struggled with the weight of their experiences. For some, the memories of the kindness they had received from their American captors were too overwhelming to reconcile with the atrocities they had witnessed and, in some cases, been complicit in. The emotional toll of being treated with compassion by the very soldiers they had once tried to destroy was a conflict they could not easily resolve. The shame they felt for their role in the war was compounded by the sense of guilt that came from accepting kindness from their enemies. Ingrid, who had spent years on the Eastern Front caring for wounded soldiers, was particularly affected by the dissonance between the brutality of the war and the compassion she had received in captivity. The war, with its ideology of racial superiority and the dehumanization of entire populations, had been the driving force behind her actions. She had been part of a system that justified violence and suffering in the name of nationalism. But now, in the quiet of a post-war Germany, she could no longer ignore the dissonance between what she had been taught to believe and what she had witnessed in those American POW camps. The simplicity of the shower, the humility of the experience, had stripped away her illusions of power and superiority. The American soldiers, for their part, had their own challenges in processing their role in the captivity of the German nurses. Many of them had fought across Europe, enduring brutal battles, witnessing the horrors of war up close. They had fought to end the tyranny of the Nazi regime, to restore peace to a continent shattered by violence. Yet, in the face of the German women, they were forced to reckon with a different side of the war. The POWs were not just the enemy. They were human beings, with their own fears, guilt, and struggles. The kindness extended to these women in the form of food, shelter, and care was a reflection of the values that the Allied forces had fought for, values of compassion, humanity, and respect for life. Even in the face of the enemy, for the American soldiers who had witnessed the women's emotional reactions, the impact of their care lingered long after the war ended. Many of them reflected on how the act of caring for the enemy had been one of the most profound and challenging aspects of their service. War had trained them to see the enemy as something less than human, but in the POW camp, they were forced to confront the humanity of their captives. The nurses who had been ordered to shower with soap and the nurses who had been reduced to tears became symbols of the deep psychological toll that war had taken on both sides. For the American soldiers, the kindness they showed their prisoners was a reminder that even in the darkest moments of conflict, there remained a choice between dehumanization and compassion in the years following the war. The experiences of the German women in Texas began to fade from public consciousness. The world moved on, focused on rebuilding, on healing the scars of war. But for Ingrid and the other nurses, the memories of their captivity, of the shower, and of the tears would never fully leave them. It became a part of their post-war identity, an experience they could neither forget nor fully comprehend. The war had taken so much from them, but it had also given them something they never expected, a glimpse into the kindness that could exist even between enemies. The shower had stripped them of their pride, but it had also shown them the possibility of redemption, of forgiveness, of humanity. Ingrid's post-war life was not an easy one. She returned to Germany, but she was not the same woman who had left. The war had left its scars on her body and soul, and the memory of her time in the Texas POW camp only deepened the emotional wound. She struggled with feelings of guilt for her past actions, as well as a deep sense of shame for her role in supporting a regime that had caused so much suffering. Yet, despite these challenges, Ingrid found herself changed in profound ways. She no longer viewed the world through the lens of national pride or ideological fervor. Instead, she saw the world in terms of its shared humanity, and this understanding informed everything she did moving forward. For the other German nurses, the journey of reconciliation was equally complicated. Many of them struggled with the internal conflict of having been part of a system that had committed atrocities and yet had been treated with kindness by their captors. Some never fully reconciled these conflicting emotions, while others found ways to integrate their experiences into their post-war lives. Some became active in the reconstruction of Germany, working to rebuild their country in a way that acknowledged the horrors of the past, while others chose to remain silent about their experiences, unable to confront the pain of their memories. But for all of them, the memories of their time in captivity, of the shower in Texas, would remain. It became a moment in their lives that marked the end of their participation in the war and the beginning of their struggle to understand the moral complexities of their past. For Ingrid, the emotional wounds of the war would never fully heal. But the compassion shown to her by her captors, strangers, enemies, soldiers, had opened a door to a new way of understanding the world, one that would stay with her for the rest of her life. In the end, the legacy of the German women POWs in Texas was not just about their role in the war or their treatment as prisoners. It was about the unexpected lessons of humanity and compassion that emerged in the most unlikely of places, the sterile, hot showers of a Texas POW camp. Their emotional reckoning would become a symbol of the war's psychological toll, not just on soldiers, but on the very people who had been caught in its web. The shower, the soap, the tears, these simple acts would forever serve as reminders that war's deepest scars are not always visible to the eye, but are often carried in the hearts and minds of those who lived through it.